I'm Gail Zachman, Associate Director of the Shorenstein Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the center. I'm also delighted to open The New Jew, How Sports Shaped Jewish Identity and the Zionist Movement, our event today. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Ofer Idels, who Professor Gordon will introduce in just a moment. I'd like to, before we begin, thank Rebecca Jefferson, curator of the Esther Ray Price Library, and thank her for the use, once again, for hosting us at this beautiful Judaica suite. I'd also like to make you aware of just a few events that are coming up. So the first is the Jewish South, a lecture by Shari Rabin, which will be held at the Jacksonville Jewish Center on March 11th, and it will be moderated by Dr. Rachel Gordon. Another event that we'll be holding is on March 24th, and that's part of the Greenberg Lecture Series. That lecture will be by Dr. Aviva Ben-Hur, Carnival in the Caribbean. Finally, I'd like to ask you all to save the dates between April 6th and April 18th, when we will hold the annual Gainesville Jewish Film Festival. We hope to see you there. Tonight, our moderator will be Dr. Rachel Gordon, who is our Shorenstein Professor of American Jewish Culture and Society, and it will be commented by Dr. Roy Heller, who is our Professor of Israel Studies at the Shorenstein Center. I wish you all a good event, and thank you for coming.
Welcome, Dr. Ofer Idels is the Belzberg Fellow in Israeli Studies at the University of Calgary, is the author of Zionism, Emotion, Language, and Experience, published by Cambridge University Press, and Embodying the Revolution, the Hebrew Experience, and the Globalization of Modern Sports in Interwar Palestine. And he's in conversation with Professor Roy Heller, who is Assistant Professor of Israel Studies here, and his first book, The Pretenders, Passing in Israeli Literature, will be published this summer by Purdue University Press. Looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
My challenge, to hold the mic, or I'm fine, yeah? So basically my challenge is to change the slide from down here and read my notes from here and holding the mic. So, but if you have to make a decision, watch the slides, they're much more interesting. Also, all the quotes are there and the faces and everything. Okay, so like 40 minutes, something like that, 40, yeah, there's, okay. Who's in charge on the time? That's all I'm asking. Okay. Okay, so it's over there. So I will speak to you today about my book, which was recently published. And as historians usually do, I'll give you a spoiler right ahead. I'll tell you what the book is about. So yeah, it's down there. So we have a lot of books on the guy on the left, the pioneer. We get also about the soldier and the pioneer, that it's Yitzhak Rabin, of course. And we don't have a lot of scholarship, perhaps even definitely not in English, about that guy, the athlete. So the book, what it's basically trying to do is trying to define what does it mean to be a Zionist athlete at the interwar years, from reason I'm going to explain the chronology very soon, but also through that, trying to reflect and think about what Zionism is and what this project of the New Jew is all about. Yeah, okay. Told you, it's not going to be easy. You have to mingle a lot of stuff. So, yeah, if I'm forgetting the mic, please let me know. So, again, just to continue the spoiler, the argument of the book, basically, is that there is something very particular about Zionist athletes or Zionist relations to sport, and it's something that it's not fully adaptable. And the reason is that, sport is driven for a competition, pleasure, but also have a very autotelic meaning. You do sport for its own sake, okay? And we'll think about it later, in a few minutes, but that Zionism was very hard to accept some kind of a cultural phenomena where you do by yourself. It's not necessarily clear what its contribution is to the nation, to the revolution of the new Jew. So yeah, I'm not going to do that. So we have a few chapters, which I have to do it over here. Okay, so there's a few chapters. We're not going to touch about all of them today, but just to let you know, pretty much the first three chapters kind of describes this gap between Zionism, or this tension between Zionism and modern sport. And the last two are dedicated to two arenas, two elements in which sports and Zionism could have kind of coalesced in some ways. Internationalism, where you can send a competition, and in the end, militarization, mostly after the Arab Revolt in '36. And we got also an epilogue, which was kind of reflective and so forth. So this is a very quick summary of the book. But since it was published like a few months ago already, and you know the manuscript was submitted even before, so as many of you probably know, you have some time to reflect of it even more and trying to see exactly what exactly this book do in the current moment. And oh, good. Now it's going to jump probably. Okay. So thinking about the field that I'm working on, it used to be Jewish studies, now it's Israel studies, or the history of Zionism. You know, there's many titles, but I think specifically Israel studies, maybe even Jewish studies in some ways, is I wouldn't say suffering, but definitely is trying to face two challenges. And one is isolation, where it's basically talking to itself. Not a lot of people want to use Israel or Zionism as kind of an example or as a test point where you can talk to. And on the other side, there is the need to ask what we call the right questions, so very specific questions. So if you want to study Zionism or modern Israel, you can do it, but you need to only ask a few specific questions or a few perspectives that most often than not, I would say, might prevent us from speaking about many of the particularities of Israeli culture and societies or Zionism as a whole. So with that kind of in the background, I want to speak about sport, which is always a phenomenon in the 20th century at least, that it's both global and has local context, always. And actually, one of the first sports historian, Alan Gutman, I think, which he also did like his undergraduate right here in Florida University. I think he's now already in his 90s, but he published a very pivotal vocal book From Ritual to Record, The Nature of Modern Sports. And basically the book starts that he's an American. He goes to Germany, I believe, to watch a football match, a soccer match, sorry. That's the best I can do for you. And he's like, oh my God, this atmosphere here is so much different when I'm going to a baseball game. It's very different. And so that's pretty much how the history of sports, or at least its American track, started. And also in Israel, I would say, there is a very particular, a very different sports culture. Israelis, as there is some of you here in the crowd, usually say there's no sports culture in Israel. So of course there is a sports culture in Israel, but it's just very different, very particular. And let's take, for example, this quote. Yeah, I have to. This is an Israeli football player, soccer player named Dan Roman. We have a lot of these quotes, but here, for example, he tells a newspaper, a website, his experience when finally moving to play in Europe. And he says, in Israel, everything is hard, everything's stressful. In Holland, everything is easy. You come to practice, everything is orderly. People smile at you, even if you lose. When the fans speak to you, they do so respectfully. So something that's much more also fun, respectable. It's okay to lose. And definitely, if you go for the American sport, it's much less about entertainment, but much less about consumerism. Everything changes. And now I'm going to do something very not professional, but that's like a photo of Israeli sport. Oh, that's not here. Yeah, okay. That's like Israeli crowd. That's not really representative. I'm doing, but it's very different. For example, when I had to participate or like help in a Calgary sports event for it's a private school because my daughter goes to the Jewish school, so it's like. So that's like a competition of a private school in Calgary. So doing athletics, they did everything there, including the pole vault, which I was kind of amazed kids can do it without practice. But again, very much different. Just like going there, you cannot see it in the photo, but there's already selling selling food from trucks there, and I guess maybe it's very common and very ordinary for people of you, but for Israelis, it's very much different experience for how you engage with sport. We can also, for example, and that's a spoiler for the book because that's how it starts with this famous sketch from the 90s, written by Edgar Carrot. We won't get to the entire sketch. It's about the Holocaust, but the entire premise is that like this is the Israeli athlete, okay, and those are the international athletes, okay. So we have this very interesting or very particular sports culture, and we need to ask ourselves why. It's not that obvious. Yeah, if Israeli culture and Zionism is very much dedicated to create this new Jew, strong, healthy, muscular, all those cliches. Yeah, from Nordau, muscular Judaism, today, of course, the pioneers, soldiers. So what happened to the athletes exactly? Why doesn't it fit? So we have this, what I think some kind of a bizarre question. Okay, so just to begin, if we go back to Gutmann from ritual to record, so basically his premise of the book is that modern sport is a new phenomenon, that it's distinct from other kinds of competitions or play or games that were before, that were pre-modern. So he has this table, you probably cannot see it, but it's like only modern sport has all the characteristic, and as again, it's very much the start of his sports history. But the premise is that sport is a modern phenomenon. So also for us, as people trying to think about in relation to Zionism, we need to look at the modern time, yeah? Not going all the way back to, I don't know, pre-modern or Hellenic time, as some of us do. Also, if we look, for example, at the Oxford Dictionary, it tells us pretty much how they describe sport, an activity involving physical exertion and skill, especially one regulated by a set of rules or customs in which an individual or a team competes against another or others. Yeah, I'll make this bigger here so I can read other quotes. But as you can see, it's about competition. It's about skill. It has to be regulated. And for example, from here, if we look at the 18th century, you cannot see it here. Oh, I just moved it from myself. It probably will happen a few more dozen times until the end of the lecture. So this is, for example, a drawing for a boxing match in the 18th century. But I don't know if you can look at this guy, for example, he holds the clock, okay? Because it's a modern phenomenon, it has to be regulated. One of the reasons it has to be regulated so you can gamble on it, because it's very hard to gamble if you don't know who's the winner exactly, or you cannot decide who's the winner. That's a Mendoza the Jew. He's a very famous boxer from the Jewish, from the 18th century, which is actually a very nice book. It's a graphic novel, so it's also interesting in the terms of how you do exactly history as a graphic novel. So recommend that as well. Not my book, but go by. Okay. So that's sport, something very regulated, modern. And it's very much spread in the British Empire, because it starts in British, and also over here in North America. However, it's pretty much a lot of countries, but it's not the entire world. And in many ways, in Central Europe, they're much more dedicated to gymnastics or turnen, which in many ways, it's also a modern phenomenon. It's about how we, as a German nation, can educate our new middle class for physical education and also prepare it for the army. Yeah? But it's very strictly not competitive. We're going to do all of the elements we know from gymnastics today as a sport, but we're going to do it for healthy, moralistic, create discipline, but much not competitive. For them, competitive sports bring radicalization, it's not healthy, it creates injuries, and so forth. So we have those two modern tracks about how to think about modern physical culture. Yeah, and it's also spreads around the world. It's not just in Germany or even in Europe. We got here, for example, that's in Czechoslovakia, that's in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey, and that's in Philadelphia, people doing gymnastics in the 19th century. And also, as you can guess, or hopefully guess, it also arrives to the Yishuv. First, for Max Nordau, who is still in Europe, of course, when he thinks about muscular Judaism, he thinks mostly about gymnastics as the way to create this new Jew that he thinks about. But also arrived to the Maccabi movement during the terms of the Second Aliyah in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Ottoman Palestine. So you can see pretty much the same equipment in both, in Berlin and in Tel Aviv. So they're dedicated to gymnastics. And we don't have to read all those quotes, which are over here, but I'll sum it up for you. It's basically quotes from before the interwar period, from the Ottoman period, in which they tell us gymnastics is the way to go. Gymnastics is a very proud way it's excitement. That's the way to create the new Jew. Even the pioneers here at Poale Zion are saying it's part of what we're doing. We're in the same revolution, in the same essence of Zionism. Okay, you're in the city, you're in Tel Aviv, you're in Jerusalem, but we have the same goals. Okay, but as they say, life has other plans. And there is a war, World War I, you may have heard of it. And what happens in the interwar years, we have the ascent of sports from a British phenomenon or American phenomenon into suddenly a global, popular phenomenon, much started to resemble or even the same as we know it today. And this ascent of interwar sports is also the decline of gymnastics, who turns into sometimes disappearing, but sometimes just turns into physical education and that you may know from school or other places. But here we can read a quick quote from Tony Collins, which is one of the most prominent sports historians of the day, which describes interwar moment of sports from being a minority middle-class interest outside the Anglophone and Anglophile nations. Sports in the post-war world was transformed into a commercial, cultural, and political phenomenon that captured the imagination of tens of millions of people in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and command the attentions of governments and politicians. There is also a Netflix movie about that, it's a very, I forgot the name, never mind. It's about a PA teacher that arrives from England into Germany, and he tries to teach them how to play soccer, basically. And it's like, oh my God, he has a ball. What are we going to do with that? It's kind of a comical movie, so it's very nice to see. But in the interwar years, we have this ascent of sports. Sports become this kind of a phenomenon you can no longer ignore. So it's one day it's there, it's very much present, but on the other hand, it's new. It's something you can still think about, where does it come from? What do we want to do with that? Okay, it's not something you take for granted, much like today, for example. And we have in the interwar year, we started to have those first sports superstars, I think So we have those superstars. I think Max Schmeling, for example, the German boxer, who is like the German of the interwar period. We got also Babe Ruth from baseball, a sport that pretty much doesn't know anything about it, but you probably don't. Okay. We have growing, we got the first World Cup, for example, which will come here to Florida or I think Atlanta very closely. We got the Winter Olympics, which is a lot of things that they really like staying in Canada, and I, again, don't know a lot about. And also the regular Olympics very much grow at the time. They start, even though they start before the First World War, during the interwar period, they become this global spectacle that people cannot ignore. Yeah, so we got, for example, all of those stuff like the Olympic flag, the Olympic salute, the first Winter Olympic I just mentioned, the Olympic fire, the Olympic village, the torch relay, all of those symbols of the Olympic Games are interwar period. Some of them are completely by accident. For example, in 32, why they have the Olympic village? Because the Olympics are in LA, it's far away, they need to host all of the people because we're also in the middle of the economic crisis, so they don't have a lot. So, okay, let's build this village for all the athletes. And it's kind of stick for it's from Sinton. Okay, so we got that. And of course, we also have in 28 the first agreement between the Olympic International Committee and the Coca-Cola Company, which lasts since 28 till today. So as you can see, it's very much represent the turning into a global phenomenon. And we also have, in the interwar period, the golden age of Jewish sport. Benny Leonard, one of the best boxers of all time, here in New York, in America, and Wiener in Vienna, in Europe. There is a lot of rise of new immigrants or people or Jews who are trying to use sports in order to gain public recognition, financial recognition of new immigrants, or just minority groups. And as you can see, there is also a lot of, as you can guess, there's a lot of writing about this interwar period because of that in the global space, in relations to Weimar Germany, and there's a long list of books about it. I just brought you perhaps the most famous two, and also that's the context of my book, the interwar period. So now you know why I choose the interwar period. And also, indeed, also in the Yishuv, in Palestine, Jewish Palestine, we have a growing presence of sports. New newspapers, the Maccabi games, Maccabi joined by Hapoel, okay? So there's the growing presence, of sports, of competitive sports. Yeah, we also joined, they're joining the international community, they accepted to FIFA, and to the football and the IOC, and there is a growing presence of that as well. However, at the same time, as you can guess, there is something that is not clicking. That's, for example, a critique. Moshe Smilansky, a famous Hebrew writer, writes, "Our nation victory must only be realized by the old and proven way, with the book and with the plow." Okay, again, very different. But also, for example, this athlete, Walter Frankel, he arrives from Vienna, and still he says in 32, when we the Hebrews were far removed from sport. Here and there we hear scornful remarks about our physical culture. Our nation attitude towards sport is yet to be determined. Yeah, very much so, it's there, we cannot ignore it anyway, it's part of the culture, but its role in our nation, in our culture, I think that people are still debatable. It's not yet clear. And that's really much, as I said at the start, that's pretty much it's the search for meaning. Yeah, I like to say it's not very historical, but there is a reason he's half in the shadow. Yeah, that he doesn't really know his identity. Yeah, so there's a question: how could individual athletes contribute to the Zionist revolution, to Zionism? There's create a constant tension with the autotelic and self-contained nature of modern sport. Yeah, searching for meaning. Yeah, and again, we have a lot of books, both of those, that are talking about this nature of sport as kind of an autotelic phenomenon, something that has its own meaning. Meaning is internal to it. Okay. And now I'll read a few quotes So this, for example, A.D. Gordon, of course, perhaps the most famous pioneer, perhaps the most radical pioneer, and he writes to Maccabi, I'm aware that the basic premise of your association is a healthy mind and a healthy body, which is, of course, he likes it. But I ask, where is the body, our national body? If there is no body, what does this healthful regeneration do? Okay, basically, okay, you have muscles, but so what? Are you a new Jew because of that? You know, your muscles have no purpose. So you can say, okay, this is the pioneers. We know they're radicals, they know they're very ideological. But let's take, for example, Uri Kesari, which is a famous tabloid magazine in Tel Aviv, yeah, all about gossip and stuff like that. And he writes very much the same thing. The image, which is that one, it's the image of an athlete. The image does indeed attest to a body in a full health, but what of the soul? Okay, so even people from supposedly the other spectrum of the Yishuv society, the urban, cosmopolitan, they're saying the same thing. What are we doing with that? And really much the result is what Gordon also writes in his letter. It's nice, you can do sports, but it's an addition to labor, a complement to labor, or a preparation for labor, okay? It's like we're searching for this meaning, okay? Meaning doesn't come from that itself. If you want to be a professional athlete, that's contradicts someone who's dedicated his entire life to doing sports. And from that, we're getting into very kind of a contradicting stuff for sports. Okay, so this is the Maccabi movement, which is, again, considerably the middle class, and that's how they write. Sports do not aspire to create stars, okay? And is not the ultimate goal of sports to foster a record-holding individual. Our sports people must always stay humble and not think of themselves as special or outstanding, and keep away from the prima donnas. Okay? I don't know if you watched any soccer event, any sports event, but most of them are prima donnas. So we have this some kind of contradictions. We don't want to break records. We don't want to be the fastest as we can. And it's not just a quote. We can take, for example, this guy, Nicholas Herschel. There's a few Israeli here. Some of them read the book, so maybe they know. But if you do a survey in Israel, who is that? No one will know. However, he's the most prominent active athlete ever arrived to Israel or the Yishuv before. 2-time gold medalist, just before that in the Olympics before, and he is from Vienna, in a Koch Vienna wrestling team. He's a heavyweight wrestler. Okay, what else do you want that can supposedly represent the new Jew you're trying to create than a Jewish heavyweight wrestler? And he arrives to the Yishuv in 1934, just very close to Hitler. And when he arrives, he wants to be an athlete, to develop Zionism with his athletics. The human material in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, is excellent. I can already see in my mind's eyes the strong Eretz Israeli brigade I have assembled, and how it is surprised its European countries with its power and make a name for the revived in the land of the Hebrews. Okay, he's very excited. I want to create this legacy of wrestlers. It's not even expensive to wrestling as a sport. Yeah, you don't need a lot of equipment and stuff like that. Down south in Egypt, they have very good wrestlers. In Turkey also. However, instead of letting him develop the sports of wrestling, they're telling him, your father was a kosher butcher, go work at the butcher house in Tel Aviv. So you have to work there and then wrestling. And surprise, surprise, a few years later, a reporter finds him by accident in the street, and I'm telling him, I'm so tired, I have no desire to train. And indeed, in a year later, he joins the British Army when the work starts, and then moves to Australia, where he basically also have a meat factory and a wrestling team. So, and those of us who follow wrestling in Israel is pretty much non-existent. Another example is this team. Young girls who are sent in 1934 to London, to the heart of the capital of the empire, in order to participate in the Women World Games. There was such a thing. And everybody knows they're unexperienced athletes, but no one cares, because they're all born and they're all Hebrews, as they say. And that's how they report it also. The heart is full of joy to see our flag, the blue-white Star of David flag, magnificently waving beside the American and the Italian, the Japanese and the French, the English, Polish and German flags. It's a real Bible of language over here, but most importantly, our language is heard here too. Okay, so they know they're going to lose, but they don't care about that. They care about what they call rejoining history, yeah? Being part of the community, being like everybody else. And it's also very clear they don't care about losing, because this is a Jewish colonel, a British Jewish colonel. He writes back to Tel Aviv, and in telling them the team he just watched in London was a fine spirit of sportsmanship. In accepting defeat with cheerfulness and dignity was one of the outstanding features of the meeting. In a world that is internationally selfish, it's good to see that the athletes from Palestine can set an example of how to lose gracefully. Okay, so they really didn't care about that. And we can also compare it to other stuff. So again, there is something that is missing. And we can also read, for example, this quote, who describes a boxing event in Tel Aviv. The atmosphere, cold as ice, regained in the hall. The onlookers sat as though drowsy. The psychological contact between the crowd and the stage was lacking. The thousands of hidden strands that connects the boxer with his fans were missing. Basically, in short, they are bored. They're not excited with that. It's not they don't know what they see. And that's another quote. Again, he's another reporter. It's a different reporter from the same newspaper, but he's talking about young kids who come to see a football match, which is a soccer match. He writes, they take greater pleasure in playing tag among the crowd, exchanging blows, bothering the adults, and embedding the ushers' lives. They don't visit the pitch to see, to be moved, and to imbibe what is beautiful and aesthetic in human movement. So again, they don't get excited about what's happening in the field. They cannot see that this has its autotelic meaning, its own aesthetic. So again, something is missing. And we can also see, for example, those quotes that how people should cheer in a football match, what they told them. They could appreciate and even express their opinion or feeling, but only after the spectacular contest and not in the middle, okay? Don't get too excited, don't be that. Or for the other one may speak of sport affectionately and even passionately, but one should not make it into an absolute monarch of extreme sport zealots do, okay? And we can also see the picture here where the sports fans are basically animals who don't know how to behave. And it's also said the boxing ring is not a zoo. So yeah, there is like this, in one side, these people getting bored, they don't understand it. And on the other side, people are really afraid that they're too emotional almost, okay? That they will be dedicated into this thing that this sport has its own meaning. How much time do I have? Okay, I think like it, yeah. Okay, we don't have to read this entire quote. This is basically very shortly from the last book about militarization and how the Arab revolt is when the soldier become this representative of Zionism. You can also don't have to be a pioneer, but you can also be a soldier, and how people from Maccabi movement and the sports movement react to that, basically see it as an opportunity because, okay, we cannot be pioneers if we're athletes, maybe we can be soldiers. And we don't have to read it all, but for example, here he said, we will conquer the land not only with flags and a band. I don't totally dismiss it, but also with total sacrifice in the last battle, which may end even beforehand with the final defeat. We have to learn to sacrifice everything. The short, I'll summarize the failing. They're not able to do it, okay? But it's this entire thing that they're like trying to find new meaning through militarization, basically. Okay, and now I'll start to conclude, but with a quick jump to the 90s. So in the 90s, for example, we have a lot of people arrive from the collapsing Soviet Union, which include also immigrations of very athletes. All of them are world class in what they're doing. And indeed, in the Sydney Olympics, which was in 2000, a lot of them arrived to very good achievements in sports that Israel usually doesn't have representation at all. However, very quickly, most of them, at least 3 of them, are leaving Israel into other places, into Canada, into Germany, from different reasons. But there's no continuation to their sport. So very much like Nicholas Herschel, which we mentioned, even in the 90s, something was missing. If you say to Israel, I want to be an athlete, and I want to join the Israeli culture by being an athlete, it's a hard goal, and it's not working for most of them, who end up leaving to other countries. But we can also have another example. During the 90s, for example, as many people in my age remember, they're starting to broadcast the Champions League. And it's very much, they think that soccer is now something very cultural, something which is you could learn to enjoy. And indeed, the sentence that was mostly associated with the game is when the producer, Modi Baron, who passed away a few years ago, is turning into the camera and said to the audience, Tevalu, enjoy. Okay, meaning, again, Israelis have to, in some ways, educated to see sports or soccer as something cultural that you can enjoy. Again, so there's a trend that takes us all the way back to the 90s and how we Israeli understand sports and sports culture. But as you can probably guess, professionals. Okay, so now I'll shortly conclude. I have to do that because I have to read my notes. Okay, so I'll read it as it is. So what can the history of sports tell us about Zionism? First, it helps us to break the isolations of the subfield. Sport, as we just saw, is by its definition a global and transnational story. And it pushes us to ask larger questions that place the Yishuv or Israel back within the interwar world of mass culture, amateurism, professionalism, internationalism, the globalization of the modern body experience, and so forth. And indeed, sports historians are usually a very nice group of people who are really enjoying communicating with me. But also, more internally perhaps, it offers us some kind of a new interpretive frameworks for understanding local particularities. In the sense that in the last few decades or so, scholarship has tended to think about Zionism and ideology as something top-down, while everything which is urban culture was kind of distinct from it or separated or really kind of seeing Zionism as kind of a myth. And while looking at sport, we see something quite different, something that Zionism was not entirely pioneers, but was something people took themselves and think from themselves or had constant presence about their role in this is a revolution of Jewish sovereignty. As Amos Oz once said, a basement in Tel Aviv is also Eretz Israel. So I think with that I will conclude. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, should I? One, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I don't know what's the good position. All right, I'll stay here and talk. Thank you very much, Ofer, Professor Dr. Idels, for coming to our campus. Thank you, Professor Ryan, for inviting me to be a discuss and to comment on this fascinating topic. And thank you for my students who also arrived. I see you. You'll get rewarded. Thank you for coming over here tonight. First, let me say that I am probably the last person to speak about sports. It's not for me. I am not the sports type. I get really, really exhausted really, really fast when there's, when soccer is involved. after 10 minutes of running after the ball, I just turn off the TV. I can't. And my daughter's here, and recently I told her you should go do some school sports, maybe go lift some weights, and she told me why. I know it's heavy. I just had this idea that Jews and sports, they just don't they don't mix together. And yes, growing up in Israel in the 90s, I mean, sports was everywhere around us, but you wouldn't necessarily participate in it, right? You kind of watch it from a safe distance. I mean, nobody drives their kids around the country for peewee baseball. We don't have time for that kind of stuff. And, let me just give you another one. What's the Hebrew word for sports? Does anybody know? Yeah, there's no Hebrew. There's one which I learned from the book, which is milab, right? Milab, which sounds like a skin condition, something you wish it was benign. But yeah, we don't use it, right? That's the official word. So we use sports, and this is kind of the center of embodying the revolution. It asks the question: why this rough beginnings of sports and Eretz Israel? And it's a fascinating question because, as we've heard, right, the spoken class, the Jewish body was really central to the Zionist project, right? The body, the physical body, and to the Yeshuv in early Eretz Israel, and these things happened right where modern sports happened as well, right? Modern sport as we know it. So in other countries and cultures saw immense pride in their national athletes. Early Hebrew culture, they couldn't care less. Or as Dr. Idels argues, they actually care to proactively remove sports and sports competition from its core identity. And I quote, don't remember who said it in the book, but it was a form of foreign mimicry with no reason or honor. Right, and I think first of all, for this alone, the book is important and crucial in our time, not because it sheds light on the dismissal of sports in early Zionist ideology, but also because it kind of shifts that spotlight back to Zionist discourse, and it's something that people, don't really want to touch right now with a 10-foot pole. But here, Zionism rises again as a unique player, right? Not as something global. But something that refuses to, always align with broad definitions. But then back to the point. It seems like a strong connection between sports and Eretz Israel should have been obvious, right? The Zionist narratives, as we heard, emphasize the gathering of exiled diaspora Jews in a single geographical, right, preferably biblical location, and with it, they wanted to see a physical and national rebirth of the Jewish body, right? So visions of race quickly materialized in the early Jewish settlements of Mandatory Palestine, and a new Hebrew was created. Lo and behold, we have the stereotypical diasporic Jew with the fiddler, he stepped down from the roof and descended on from the shtetl to work in the sun-drenched field of Israel. So when trying to explain this stuff to my class, I tend to use visual aids, and one of them is a 1935 film called "This Is the Land," Zot hi haaretz, and I was excited to see a reference of it in the book. The movie was directed by Baruch Agadati, and it presents the life of the Yeshuv, introduces the world not only to Jewish settlement, but for the first time, right, this image of the new Hebrew. So for an entire hour, you see these guys work in the field, herd the sheep, drain the swamps, with half naked in the Mediterranean sun. And of that hour, a whooping 3, maybe 4 minutes are devoted to New Hebrew physical recreation. All right, and it's sandwiched somewhere between the construction of new buildings in Tel Aviv and the celebration of Purim. And there we learn, you have the announcer on the screen, not only for the health of the soul we aspired, but also for the health of the body. All right, so the film then kind of pivots to the beach, where the pioneers are briefly allowed to put down their hose and enjoy the small pleasures of life. And these moments are so negligible in the film, compared to the sheer volume of manual labor done, that's being portrayed, that before reading Ofer's book, I had completely missed them. And I did watch the film a number of times, and they were made to be missed, right? These books, the book shows us that the early settlement in Eretz Israel feared sports. And if I understand it correctly, right, for a number of reasons. One, sports came to Eretz Israel with inherent foreignness, right? The language. There's a lack of proper Hebrew words to describe sports, sporting events. Boxing in Hebrew is boxing. Champion is often just been transliterated. So they felt some potential risks of external influences. And Idels recounts, for example, how even Jewish athletes who came from abroad to tour or compete Eretz Israel were kind of given the cold shoulder by the locals, who frowned upon their foreignness, their inability to speak Hebrew. Similar questions were also raised, where new immigrants added to the national teams went to represent the Yishuv abroad. So can a Hungarian-speaking Jew who recently moved, right, to Mandatory Palestine represent Eretz Israel or embody, right, the image of the new Hebrew? Was that the image that the Yishuv was trying to project? I think today, Israeli basketball teams are heavily rely on African American players, so nobody seems to find that controversial. But back then, a German accent was enough to spark a national identity crisis. Now, the second thing, that I sort of understood from reading the book, the push against sports is the purposelessness of it. Right? We have swamps needs to be drained, fields that need to be plowed, and who has time for messing around with a ball? The book teaches us that Zionist thinkers understood the importance of a healthy body, but were apprehensive about sports' lack of contribution to the national soul. Right? So while Jewish sports thrived in the diaspora, and the book mentions, right, and we heard of the talk, Jewish boxers who really fought those stereotypes of the meek and feminized Jew, their sort of brethren in Eretz Israel kind of shrugged and wagged their fingers and criticized boxing as useless, violent, and degrading spectacles. Right? So spending time in the boxing ring had to contribute something, right? In the eyes of the Yishuv in Eretz Israel, it had to contribute something to the land, right? Contribute something back to the land. So, and if we go to the film from before, right? Even those 3.5 minutes where you see the kind of sports activities are laced with depictions of uniforms, of military parades, of formations, and kind of drills. And God forbid, the people just have a good time for a second, right? And which I also appreciated about Embodying the Revolution, as it shows us how the new Jewish body was not just an ideal, but in reality, a machine, right? A machine to be put into use. The new Hebrew is not just a poster boy of Zionism, but a tool that needs to work and protect the land. Otherwise, this was all for nothing. And in that spirit, Idels traces the final acceptance of sports as an integral part of the Hebrew experience. And I do hope I read the book right. And not when Jews started winning medals, but when it became clear that athletic training can provide a military advantage on the battlefield, right? I teach this story by Binyamin Tammuz from 1951 called Swimming Contest. And you have a Jewish narrator who's a descendant of immigrants to Palestine, and an Arab local engage in a swimming competition. It happens on the eve of the first Israeli-Arab War. I'm going to read a quote from the book. I really love it. The Jew, he's a member of Haganah, and he loses. And the book, the short story says, Abdul Karim and I dived in, says the Jewish narrator, either because I was overexcited or wasn't used to fresh water, I sank to the bottom like a stone, and by the time I had recovered sufficiently to surface, Abdul Karim was already halfway across. By the time I reached the pipe landing from the pump house, Abdul Karim was already sitting on the parapet on the far side, squeezing the water out of his hair. The Israeli Jewish narrator says, you wait until I'm grown up and I will beat you right here in the pool. And Abdul Karim says, if you ever manage to beat me here in the pool, it will be very bad indeed. And then he looks at his Arab family and he says, bad for all of us. Right, so it's a didactic story, and the pool, of course, symbolizes the land, right? It's a metaphor, and the swimming is a contest over the territory. But it's fascinating because Dr. Idels points out that in the book that the Yeshuv interest in water sports emerged precisely during the Arab Revolt. Swimming, like gymnastics, was perfect for the Zionist narratives. It works on all body parts equally, right? Neglecting no muscle. It was the ideal useful sport. So useful, in fact, that in the book, right, there's a quote of Hamakabi Journal that concluded that swimming should eventually become our national sport in Eretz Israel, right? So more than everything, it's useful. I think, really, I couldn't think about anything. I mean, it's the kind of immediate thought that came to my mind. I think for a very specific reason, right? Not for winning in the pool, not swimming for winning in the pool, but sort of for the long-standing fear that without putting up a fight, the Arabs would push Jews into the sea, right? So if they push to the sea, they might as well know how to swim. So, definitely why it kind of became the idealized national sport. So I really found myself drawn to that discussion, right? The 5th chapter on militarism and the idea of useful sport, since it's a concept that beautifully encapsulates the psyche of Eretz Israel, the military complex of sports training, not to be seen as silly and useless, but as a preparation for the combat soldier, right? You, as an Israeli, that you will inevitably become, right? So go ahead, do some sports, have fun. The book notes that this relationship between military culture and sports became symbiotic. I mean, I remember growing up, the 16-year-olds, the 7-year-olds, engage in pre-military training and went down to the beach, running, crawling, jumping, toning their bodies and able to be able to join elite combat units in the future. And watching sports as children is also the perfect preparation for that mindset, because military jargon has infiltrated the world of Israeli sports pretty early on. And it's also, everything is in the book right now. The stuff is not mine. If you think about matches, right, football, soccer matches in Israel are described of battles or fights. The word for midfielder is pioneer. Scoring a goal is called a conquest, right? And then there's no wonder that modern Israeli soccer matches between Israeli Jewish and Israeli Arab teams are often charged, right? Always charged. But yeah, I'm going political, and I don't want to go there. There is a great article in Hatanin Student Journal coming up. I saw Adam Popko here before, but he writes about that connection between Israelis and Arabs on the football field in Israel. But I feel like I've taken some time already, so I'll clear the stage for questions. I'm sure you have many, and maybe we can all meet on the lawn after for a game of whatever. Thank you very much.
Can I say just a few words? So, just first of all, thank you very much. It's always nice to hear. It sounds like an interesting book. If you have a copy, I'll very much like one. But no, thank you. And it's always interesting to hear someone speak about your book after you write it in your computer for a few years. And it's actually, I completely agree with all of those. You summarize it beautifully and accurately. It's 2 short editions. First, yes, this purposelessness of sport is in the heart of the book, but purpose in the issue doesn't have to be swamps or military and stuff. It can also be, for example, a theater actor who's in a bima, who is like contributed to Hebrew culture. Okay, so it's remembered that it's like there's a large spectrum which sports try to find its place. And the second thing that, yes, the book kind of ends with militarization, and before that with internationalism, is kind of platforms that Zionism could find some meaning with through sports. But it's important to emphasize that those avenues eventually fails. Maccabi movement or Paul movement doesn't become like this new pre-militarization for that's for the Palmach and later the IDF and so forth. Because, as I said, because sports has its kind of like, you have to take it seriously about how you its own philosophy, if you say, its own phenomenology, that you have to like really enjoy it, okay, and take it like do it for its own sake, and then you can find the other meanings to say, because I find so much meaning about it, so now I can say it's a representing of our nationality and or so forth, or whatever you want, what kind of symbolism you want to stick to sport. So that's the point. Yeah. Thank you. And I'm glad to. Yes, Anna.
I was going to handle questions, but we are a pretty small group. I cannot run on. Maybe you want the microphone.
Not sure I need it. Okay. I would like to be a bit provocative, and I would like to consider the possibility of a gap, maybe even a huge gap, between public discourse and social reality. Between the Agadati film and the A.D. Gordon quotes, etc., and maybe a very active sports scene in Jewish Palestine. I mean, when I think about soccer, for example, soccer matches, in some cases, were able to draw thousands of spectators in the very, very small, tiny city of Tel Aviv. When Hakoach Vienna comes to Palestine, I mean, everyone is so excited about it. Everybody talks about it. The Hebrew press writes about it, and there are, thousands of people coming there. The fact that in Hebrew we say sport, which is the English word, is not that surprising. You yourself said that different sports disciplines came from Great Britain and were spread all over the world. If you look at the history of soccer in Argentina, and soccer in Argentina is a big thing, we can agree on that. For various decades, the use of the English words, they said corner, not esquina, the Spanish word for corner, referee, and not arbitro or juez in Spanish, etc. In most countries, I think, especially as far as soccer was concerned, the vocabulary was the English one. So it's not that surprising. And I don't know, maybe it's because of my own scholarly work on soccer, maybe it's because my family has been in Jewish Palestine since the 1880s. I mean, for my father as a kid in the 1930s, in Tel Aviv in the 1930s, sport was probably more important than any Zionist ideal. I mean, A.D. Gordon? Who the heck was A.D. Gordon? I mean, for a young kid in Tel Aviv of the 1930s. He was born in 25, so in the mid-30s, he's a young kid. So maybe what you present has to do with some aspects of Zionist ideology, yes, but does it necessarily relate to social realities in Jewish Palestine?
Sure.
So it was too long.
No,
Yeah.
very good question. Thank you. So I'm very glad that you asked it, Renan, and it's a very pinpoint question, and I'll pack it in a few levels. First, in perhaps the more anecdotal one. Yes, when Hakoach Vienna arrives to Palestine, to the Yishuv, it's a big event. There's no way to deny it. I think it's more about the fact that they are kind of celebrities arrives and less about the fact that it's soccer, and it's also kind of reflective in the newspapers. It's like when Hakoach Vienna arrives in 24, it's very much about they have those Jewish famous Jewish team that arrives arrives here to the Yishuv, and through them we kind of they're thinking about, at least in the press, the Hebrew press, the local press, what's the role of sports in this new society? It's like, can we do what they're doing in Europe? Is it okay for us? It's not. And the reason, and actually it ends with the fact that they don't know Hebrew. So it's very good that they know soccer, they're very good in soccer, but they don't know Hebrew. So again, so that's just on one level. Regarding the language, you are of course right. It's not that particular that a lot of the language remain. We'd put an asterisk about it just against the fact that, like, because we're in the issue, we're in the middle of creating modern Hebrew as a talking language, so they care a lot when they're using when they're not translating specific terms, okay? So there is this, perhaps is a kind of a proof that sports develop from below and not top down, which it's definitely the case. But when I would just say, like, I think when Zionists talk about their language, it's a little bit different than like when people in Argentina talk about it. So that's that. Now for the big question, okay, the heart of your question, is it just I described some top-down ideological, and while in reality it's completely different. People care and they don't care about that, and I'll have to break it for, I think. First, as you said, I also gave a lot of quotes from the Maccabi movement, which is more interesting than, for example, for a poem movement. Okay, so which again, it's not necessarily so much top down anymore. Okay, because they're not people in the Istadrut, their power is not that, and you see very similar patterns to those you can see in a poem, or at least more ideological one, and that on that. Second, I have a few sources which are in the book, which are more, I can say, personal and stuff like that. But as you can guess, those are much harder to find. So I did work with the sources I had. Which I don't know. Again, it's a good question. If you create a newspaper, okay, if you're reading the VAR, which is the labor movement, okay, you can. But Haaretz, sports columns that people are coming from that. I think it's become less distinctive between that, and two more points. The first one is that you're right. It is something that started as from the bottom. I said in the interwar period, you cannot deny that, like, sport is a new phenomenon. It's everywhere. It's not, I don't know, like trying not to use AI or trying not to use, like, cell phones. I don't know. It's already like a smartphone, like 20 years ago, or social media. You can deny that, but it's something that's new, it's something that people think about, okay? And it definitely didn't start from Maccabi movement, which were much more happy if people would just continue doing gymnastics, but they have a lot of quotes in the book saying, oh, we want to do gymnastics, that's the healthy thing for us, but the young people want to do sports because it's exciting. They are wrong, but we have to do it because otherwise no one will come to our gymnastics class. So, yes, but and that's the important thing. Okay, it's very hard. I tried. I bring also in this lecture. There's more in the book, quotes about, like, people describing sports event. Again, they're quite disappointing actually. There was, like, new immigrants that arrived from Poland and now they're sport journalists. And they are quite disappointing, as both of those quotes, that people are bored or don't understand the games. And those are the sources that we have. So it definitely existed over there. And doing an historical picture is, I'm trying to work with the sources that I got. And yes, there is a lot of people who arrive who are excited about sports. And again, you cannot ignore it, but there's something there. And that's also the reason I'm starting the book in the 90s, because there is such debate we have in many places around the world, also in Germany, for example. But in Germany, you have also Max Schmeling, who is a professional sport boxing. And the reason, the fact that he's in the Yishuv, such a figure is not arising. And basically, professionalism in sport is something that arrived much, much, much later. So we can have this debate, methodological debate, or a conversation, but there is still something there, I would say, that we need to track. Okay, so that's a very long answer, sorry.
I guess another component of Professor Ryan's remark, what I thought was about what's the popular culture and the heroes of the younger generation in the country. And in that way, I guess I was assuming that for Israeli, are you okay?
Sure. Yeah, fine.
For Israeli young people, maybe like American Jews, I think it's pretty common to look up to athletes. But in the US, there's this narrative I always hear, which is when there's some successful Jewish writer or someone in the entertainment industry or even like a Jewish doctor who's saying, as a kid, I always wanted to be a basketball player. But of course, then I found out I couldn't be. And it's sort of implicit, like, because I was some Jewish kid who was not as tall as whoever else or had those skills, I had to go this other path, which was this incredibly other successful path. And I guess I thought part of the cool thing about the Israeli experience was that, at least for much of the 20th century, this might have been the one country where those, young Jewish people who were dreaming of being some kind of athlete maybe actually could have. And I think of it like that quotation, and I think it's often attributed to Ben-Gurion, but maybe it's someone else who was like, Israel's going to be this country where there are Jewish criminals and prostitutes and all the rest. Yeah. Whereas in the US, we have this like aspiring middle class, upper middle class, you go into a kind of more professional route. And so I guess I just wondered if that is part of your story too, that this Israeli experience of actually getting to be the athlete that you might have dreamed of being as a kid.
Yes, so I mentioned in the slides, first of all, I didn't show because of the question. It's not that person. So it's actually interesting because in Europe or in the US, Jews are in line to sport as immigrants, a way to social mobility basically. Also, in the interwar years, there is quite a lot very good Jewish athletes, both in America, boxers, championship boxers, and other fields, like Koch-Vina and so forth. It just disappeared mostly in Europe after the Holocaust, of course, and in America because there's no need for social mobility through sport.
And it's pretty working class as it happens in the US in like the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Exactly. And actually if I understand your question correctly, is that like in Palestine, it's the opposite. It's if I want to advance social mobility through sports, you cannot do it. And it's like people like Hirschel, for example, end up leaving. But there's a very famous Maccabi team, soccer team that went to Australia to do a soccer game, and some of them just ended up saying, I'm staying. I want to be a soccer player and not do something else and be a soccer player. That's my meaning in life, doing sports. And if that's your meaning in life, pretty much have to go somewhere else. Sorry. And indeed, many of the people who stay also have another job. Like for example, Viktor Frankl, which I brought, he's an athlete, a long runner who arrives from Vienna, and he arrives to the Yishuv, and he's a very prominent athlete also in the Yishuv, also writing a lot of stuff with kind of intellectual. But he also a teacher in Jerusalem, in the high school, for agriculture. And actually also developed a system of developing plants without soil, like without land, something like that, which is also metaphorically for German Jews in general, in particular. But so there is a lot of them are doctors. They're contributing in other places, and sports is becoming it's kind of like an addition. Okay, so that's.
So not only in the 50s, following up on Rachel's comment of in the 50s, many immigrants, specifically those coming from northern countries, did utilize working class immigrants, did utilize sports, specifically soccer, as a way of achieving upward mobility. So you think, well, I know this is the 50s, it's a bit off your, but do you think that was a way of countering the meta-narrative, the mainstream Zionist narrative, within their way of, I don't know, showing their own Jewish identity, the diasporic Jewish identity, within this broader, mainstream Zionist perception of what sports means for the national development?
Yeah, sorry.
That's it. I really very well with that.
Yeah, but he cannot hear it there with something. As I said, it's after the time of the book, so I would say 2 points. And I will have 2 points to say. One is that we always have to remember that we talk about sport, that it's itself an historical phenomenon and a very modern phenomenon. So sports, when you talk about sports in the 20s or the 30s, it's not like in the 50s, okay? So it's a different phenomenon and much more, I would say, common and much more obvious to people, much more common as we know it today. Is it was a challenge? I'm not sure. Like people like Ben Gurion or the leadership still didn't understand what sports is all about, but they care much more than that people will represent Israel. The new state will represent in like the Olympics and stuff like that. Again, they don't care about winning that much, but they did care about people who will have like a Hebrew name where they represent Israel and that. And in Anat Hellman book about the 50s, she wrote a little bit about that. So I'm not sure if I have to guess or assume if it was like a challenge for on the establishment. Just it was just like a much broader spectrum already, like much more ingrained. Like a lot of people did sport already. It was much more about social reality. No one can imagine a world without sport, or that in the 20s, in the 30s, people can still imagine that. So that's my hitch, basically.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
I'd like to ask your opinion on how you think the 1972 Olympics massacre changed the perception of sports within Israel and the Jewish community.
So, thank you. Again, I'll have to apologize that my book ends in 39, so I don't know. But when I think about it, it's in the 70s. It's also kind of like before the Yom Kippur War. It's still like the kind of like the what we can call the after the heyday, or perhaps after the 6-day war. Everybody are excited, and again, it will be kind of a clear hypothesis. So don't quote me on that, but and delete it from the videos and everything. No, but I think it's kind of interesting that we have at this time the first, like, or not the first, but like this reaction of like a lot of on the one hand, like a lot of terrorist attacks and counter-terrorist attack. Also got like the Sabena airplane, and then of course also a few years later the Entebbe, and of course a lot of the counter-terrorist attack that happened after the Olympics. So I think it's a moment that like perhaps had this opportunity, because the myth says they had a very good team, Israel, and they might have achieved something. Then, because Israeli first medal arrived just in the 90s in Barcelona, so that if Israel won a medal, it might have changed something. But also, it's interesting that instead of perhaps sports becoming much more visible or like in the forefront of the national, it's joined, or unfortunately joined, or integrate in this narratives of terrorism and counterterrorism attack, instead of again standing by itself as something that like, you can contribute it through sports. Basically, it's become like a side note in this larger and more tragic story of the conflict.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us for this event. Thank you.